There is a weariness that echoes through the halls of Olympus, a sound not of anger, but of a profound, divine frustration. Jove, looking down upon the tangled paths of men, observes a pattern that seems as old as the stars themselves, the instinct to look upward and find a divine architect for a ruin we have built with our own hands. We speak of the long arm of heaven and the cruelty of the fates, yet the gods themselves seem to disagree, suggesting that while they provide the landscape of a life, the specific weight of our misery is often a burden of our own design. It is a tension that lives at the very beginning of the Odyssey, where the king of the gods notes that mortals are quick to blame the heavens for the disasters they have authored. This raises a question that sits quietly in the shadow of every tragedy. How much of our grief is a debt owed to the universe, and how much is a surplus of suffering we have invited through the blindness of our own hearts? We find ourselves caught in a strange paradox of agency, where we claim power in our triumphs but seek the comfort of destiny in our failures. The text suggests a sophisticated psychological boundary between the ordained, that which is truly unavoidable, and the folly that represents a self-inflicted sorrow. It is the difference between a storm at sea and the decision to sail directly into it despite the gathering clouds. We often live as though our lives are a script written by a distant hand, yet the gods look on with a quiet insistence that we are the ones holding the pen, even as we claim to be unable to read what we have written. We want to believe in a fate that absolves us of the weight of our choices, because to acknowledge the extra suffering is to admit that the heavy load we carry is not a cross given to us, but a stone we have chosen to pick up. To understand this tension, we must look at the world Homer inhabited, a world where the divine and the human were not separated by an unbridgeable chasm, but were constantly in dialogue. In this space, a warning was not merely a suggestion. It was an intervention of goodwill that bridged the gap between a choice and its consequence. The stakes were never just about the outcome of a single action, but about the integrity of the heart that makes the choice. When Mercury was sent to warn Aegisthus, it was not an act of divine tyranny, but a mirror held up to a man standing on the precipice of his own ruin. The disaster that followed was not a mystery or a sudden strike from the heavens. It was the unfolding of a map that had been clearly articulated. This was a world where responsibility was not a modern concept of accountability, but a cosmic reality of paying for everything in full. Consider first the architecture of the extra. The text posits that there is a layer of human experience entirely within our own control, a space where our greatest tragedies often occur because we refuse to distinguish between circumstance and sheer folly. We might imagine fate as the walls of a room, but the furniture of our misery, the sharp corners we bump into, the darkness we refuse to light, is of our own making. When the crew of Ulysses perished after eating the cattle of the sun god Hyperion, the text does not point to a cruel god seeking vengeance, but to men who could not restrain their own appetites. The folly here is not a simple mistake. It is a systematic refusal to acknowledge a warning that had already been given. It is the moment where the desire of the moment outweighs the reality of the price, leading to a death that is, in the logic of the text, a due. This brings us to the symbol of the warning embodied by Mercury. In the mythic tradition, Mercury is the messenger, the one who moves between worlds, carrying the clarity of the gods into the confusion of men. He represents that internal or external voice that speaks the truth of a consequence before the action is taken. To hear Mercury and turn away is not an act of ignorance, but an act of the blindness of heart. This blindness is not a lack of vision, but a psychological turning of the head, a refusal to listen to what is said in all goodwill. We stand between a warning and a desire, and in that tension we often choose the comfort of our blindness because it allows us to blame the gods when the price is finally paid. We treat the messenger as an intruder rather than a savior, preferring the ruin we understand to the restraint we do not. The blindness of heart functions as a protective mechanism, a way to externalize the aspects of ourselves we cannot bear to acknowledge. By blaming the gods for weal or woe, we attempt to escape the realization that our own character is the source of our most acute sorrows. We project the consequences of our choices onto a higher power or the universe to avoid sitting with the weight of our own repeated folly. It is a form of vanity, an attempt to make our suffering seem more grand and destined than it truly is. If the gods are responsible, then we are victims. If we are responsible, then we are merely architects of a very small and unnecessary grief. The text encourages an internal audit of these misfortunes, asking us to discern which part of our heavy load is truly ours to carry and which part is a surplus we created by refusing to see. Finally, we must consider the scapegoat mechanism. If even the gods feel unfairly maligned by human projection, it suggests that our instinct to blame luck or fate is a foundational part of the human psyche. We use the divine as a convenient externalization for our own inability to restrain the belly, that core of importunate desire that drives us to eat the cattle of the sun even when we know it will lead to our end. The gods observe this with a weary frustration because they see the bridge between the choice and the sorrow that we pretend does not exist. We are, in effect, trying to cheat the cosmos, taking the action while disowning the consequence, only to find that the price is always paid in full, regardless of whom we choose to blame. As you look back at the patterns of your own life, how much of what you call fate is actually the accumulated weight of warnings you chose not to hear? If the gods provided a messenger for every one of your self-inflicted sorrows, would you have the capacity to recognize him? Or would his voice be lost in the noise of your own heart's blindness? When you stand between a clear warning and a profound desire, which part of you is it that decides the price is not yet due? We are left with the question of whether the human mind is even capable of seeing its own folly while in the midst of it, or if the truth of our responsibility can only be discerned from a God's eye view. Perhaps the tragedy is not that we make mistakes, but that we require the ruin to be complete before we can admit who the architect was. We remain caught in the space between the ordained and the extra, wondering if we will ever learn to sit with the weight of our own hearts without looking for a God to blame for the burden